It's time for cookies and crime. Yes, I know Halloween is over. I forgot to post this. Just enjoy it. This paranormal story was sent in by Britton Jade Blanford. The story goes, my family and I used to live in an older neighborhood. There was this set of train tracks behind it. My neighbors had always seemed kind of weird about the trains, but especially their daughter. Her name was Sadie, and she was just around my age, 7 years old. Whenever I played in my backyard, I always saw Sadie in her window of the house. One day, I motioned for her to come down and play. I ran towards the front of our houses and waited for her. She came outside shortly after. I wasn't a shy kid, so I had immediately invited her into the yard to play without even knowing her name. We sat in my backyard near the corner of a fence under a tree. I would read to her lots of the time. She didn't know how to read. We had gotten to talking the first time we met, and we had figured out both our names started with an S, Sadie and Siler. It became a daily routine where Sadie would wait for me at the window, and we would go and read. But the trains always went by the house at around 5 p.m. We would usually wrap up the picture book reading before the trains came by. One afternoon, Sadie and I got distracted with one of our first chapter books. 5 p.m. rolled around, and neither mine or Sadie's parents had come to get us. A train screeched past the back of the fence, and the horns sounded loudly. The railroad crossing lights and alarm had sounded, echoing through the yard. I had looked over at Sadie to tell her we should stop reading since the trains came. Sadie began to scream, loudly. I ran over to her house and knocked on the door. The woman that had lived there answered the door. I told her Sadie needed help because she was scared of the trains. Her face went white and she began to look angry. She told me I needed to leave because what I had said wasn't funny. I walked back over to my yard, but Sadie wasn't there. I assumed that Sadie had left while I was gone, so I went inside. I felt sorry for making Sadie and her mother mad. I began making 2 cards, one for Sadie and one for her mother. My father had looked over my shoulder at what I was making. He looked at me, asking how I known Sadie. I told him that me and Sadie read outside often. He took my mom aside with the cards I was making and showed her. They called Sadie's mother over. They talked in the kitchen about what had happened. I had been upstairs and hadn't heard much except for my parents apologizing. I hadn't realized why everyone was so upset. Years later, and I'm 16 now. A few months back, my family was talking about our old house. I asked, whatever happened to my friend Sadie? They looked at me strangely and said, Siler, Sadie wasn't even your friend. Mrs. Wright's daughter Sadie died at the train tracks behind the house years before you were born.